So, for our listeners who might not be familiar, can you please explain what bystander intervention training is and its importance in today's society?
Yeah, bystanders are anybody who is a witness to something. So, a bystander, sometimes people think it has a negative connotation. It doesn't, because a bystander could be someone who observes and steps in, or it could be someone who observes and doesn't get involved. So, what I focus on in my work is trying to create active bystanders who are people who are witnesses to things, who are adjacent to anything from hate, harassment, discrimination, and who feel kind of a moral implication to get involved, but oftentimes lack the tangible skills of like, how can I make the situation better and not worse? How can I do it in a way in which I'm still keeping myself safe? And so that's what bystander training really is getting into the real nitty gritty of you see a situation, you're concerned for someone's safety, but you're also concerned for your own safety. And how do you navigate that in a very, very tangible way? And we know that if people committed to intervening every time they witness these things, it would absolutely change the culture that we're living in right now.
I have to admit, I feel a little silly, but I've never actually heard of bystander intervention training until recently. And I think it should be something that's standard. We should all know how to do this because I think this is what happens is there's something that we see and we don't know how to react. It's scary. We're fearful we may make it worse. So, how did you first become involved in teaching this intervention, and what inspired you to focus on this area?
I kind of fell into bystander intervention training in particular. So I've spent my entire career working to end gender based violence in Canada. I worked at a sexual assault center as a counselor. I've created education campaigns. But I'm so passionate about bystander intervention because I know it works. And I know that when you're looking at sexual violence, for example, less than 10% of sexual assaults in Canada are ever reported to police. So even in a world in which when people say like, oh, well, this is for the legal system to decide and to figure out, I don't have to. No, right? Because 90% of what's going on in our communities, we're going to hear about and not the police. And so I'm a survivor of intimate partner violence. I was stalked by an ex partner for over a decade. Even though I am a white woman who was born in Canada, who was educated, I was not helped by the legal system. I wasn't helped by my employer, by my school at the time because I was a student. And it was my community, it was my friends who showed up for me, who affirmed that this was not my fault, that I wasn't crazy, that I wasn't asking for it. That is what literally kept me alive. And so I'm so passionate about bystander intervention because I know it works. I've been on the receiving end of that care and that support. And I think it's a really beautiful entryway into these conversations because for so long we spoke to men as potential perpetrators and we spoke to women as potential victims. And in fact, we're all bystanders, right? You could be a survivor of abuse and still witness abuse happening to someone else. You could be, my brother, who's a 6'6" white man, who could still be witnessing something and be worried that I don't want to scare the person I'm trying to help, or because I'm a big man, is that person think, oh, I just want to get into a fight with them. He's like, I don't want to fight people, right? Like we all have I think these concerns about ourselves in terms of our safety, in terms of making it worse. And so it's not that we don't care. It's that we're frozen in fear. We're frozen in uncertainty of like, well, I don't really know what I'm seeing. Is that really not okay? Right. And so I think having the space to just unpack, oh, there are things I can do. I am not powerless, I think changes the whole approach that people have to creating a safer world because it feels realistic to be able to do. And so that's what's kept me in this work so long is like I see the light bulbs go off for people of like, oh, wait, I've done that before. I just didn't even know that was bystander intervention. And you're like, yes, it is, right? And so that's what I think is so exciting is people leave fired up instead of just like depressed about, the statistics and the reality. They feel like they have at least one thing they can do, and that then keeps them motivated to keep fighting.
And so, can you share some examples of how bystander intervention can be implemented in sort of everyday situations?
Yeah, so I work with an organization called Right to Be, and we have created this methodology called the 5 Ds, which are 5 really concrete ways that folks can intervene if they're witnessing any kind of hate or harassment. So, one of them, for example, is distract. So things like if you see someone being cornered on the bus and they're clearly uncomfortable, approaching that person and saying, hey, I'm so sorry. I'm trying to get off at the Rito Center. Do you know what stop that is? Do you have the time? as a woman, I'm a very feminine person. So if I see another woman, I'll be like, oh my God, where did you get your bag from? I'm obsessed. I've been looking for one. And the point is to distract the person being harassed so they can focus on you and ignore the person harassing them and then use that as an opportunity to get away, right? So these simple distractions like just bumping into someone, spilling something, stumbling nearby, dropping your bag, making some sort of a commotion is actually, like, we know, we have the research to back up, is an effective form of intervention that doesn't put you in harm's way because you don't look like a bystander. You look like someone who just happened to stumble or had a question about the menu at the restaurant, and so it's a really, really non-confrontational way that folks can intervene. And it's a real continuum. So you can do that. You can delegate. So, you see something happen on the bus, go and tell the driver. You're at a coffee shop and someone is being disrespectful. You flag a barista down, getting someone else to say, hey, you might not be seeing this, but I am, and you need to do something. All the way up to direct intervention for folks who do feel comfortable being confrontational, right? Like, so it's a continuum of things that people can do. And that's really my biggest message to people is, because like you said, we don't have this information readily available. People have this all or nothing attitude of like, I either got to confront a scary stranger or I'm
Right.
completely powerless. And that's not true at all. It's a continuum of things.
So, in your experience, then, what are some of those common challenges or misconceptions people have about intervening? What's their biggest fear? Is it physical harm?
Yeah, and it's so interesting because I could be talking about things at the lowest and like things that you would even consider like a microaggression, and people still think, oh my God, if I intervene, I'm going to get murdered. Like people just really go to the extreme. And so, yeah, if you're at a bar and you see two people fighting and smashing chairs over their heads, you getting involved directly, not safe. But you can go and tell a bouncer what's happening. You can go and flag it down to a staff member. That is still bystander intervention. So the biggest fear people have is harm to themselves or fear of escalation, especially men who know that, that my attempt to intervene might be taken as an invitation to get into a fist fight with someone. And so what's so great about teaching people a full continuum is that you can see them, like their shoulders kind of relax a little bit. They're like, oh, okay. I teach a bystander intervention program to children ages 3 to 10. Like, I can teach bystander intervention to a toddler. And that is not to be dismissive of the, brilliance and competency of children, but like if we can teach this to 3-year-olds, there's no reason why grown adults can't also pick up those tools in their own lives.
I had no idea you taught this to children. I think this is
Yeah.
incredible. I love this. This is exactly what I was saying. I think it should start this early because we oftentimes, it's just a skill we are not taught.
Yeah.
So I
And
love that.
I agree. Like, to me, bystander intervention skills are up there with knowing CPR, with knowing how to administer naloxone, with knowing how to administer an EpiPen. Like, these are skills that we hope we never have to use, but we're very grateful that we have them when we're presented with an emergency situation. Like, these are life skills that we all benefit from knowing. And so that's really, to me, the kind of like vibe that I bring to it is really thinking, instead of being scared and overwhelmed by the severity of what's going on in the world, which, right now there's no shortage of it, right? We're seeing rising rates of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, sexual violence, transphobia, like you name it, there's so much going on. I know why people feel powerless and paralyzed by the breadth of the problem. But when you realize actually these tiny little things that are very, very passive, that are non-confrontational, are shifting the culture in the right direction, then that's what gets people to pay attention, to get involved, and to really kind of challenge themselves to wonder, why am I freezing in this moment? Okay, well, clearly it's because I need some more training to figure out how to do this in a way that's safe.
Julie, your work has reached a really wide audience, including the Canadian Armed Forces, political leaders. How do you tailor your training to suit different groups or organizations?
Yeah, that's one of my favorite parts of this job, really, is meeting with people and saying, okay, what are your needs? Like, what are the typical scenarios that you're seeing? What are the typical barriers to intervention? Because they do vary depending on the context. So, I do these free public trainings around street harassment. So the concern that people have there is, I'm confronting a complete stranger on the train. So my concern is, they could be volatile, they could be unwell, I don't know what I'm walking into. That's very different from a workplace where you know everyone. And your concern might be repercussions, might be that people are going to view you as the troublemaker, that you're going to become the pariah of the office. And so, really talking to people to help them understand, it's not just that, the bystander effect, like, oh, human beings, we just don't get involved because we assume someone else will. Yeah, that's part of it, but there's so much more to what is holding people back. And that often can be, in a workplace context, that you're an intern, you're on contract, you are new to the position, you are the only person of color, you're the only woman, so your ability to intervene feels impossible. It's not, but you do need to know about particular set of skills that you can have when you don't have a tremendous amount of power. Versus if I go into a workplace where I'm training the leadership team, I'm teaching senior management, then we're going to talk about your role as a role model. You have an absolute obligation to get involved, but you can get involved in a more direct way because you're more protected, right? You run the joint, you pay, you sign everyone's paycheck. So you're not as concerned about your job safety as you would be as someone who's an intern, for example. And so really having those conversations with people to figure out what are your unique barriers to intervening. And that really helps people feel like, I understand that it's easier said than done. It is. I have the really uncomfortable job of going into workplaces and schools and saying to people, I am asking you to walk the harder path. It is so much easier to pretend you didn't see anything and you didn't hear anything and to just keep your head down, right? And so in order to build that trust, for people to really trust that I want to help you, it's important for me to really be reflective of what are the challenges that you're experiencing and also the types of situations. Maybe it's not as much about sexual violence and harassment in your workplace. Maybe it's more about racism or about ageism, right? The younger staff being mistreated by older staff. Like these are all real dynamics that happen that are quite unique to each space.
Your memoir has been a source of inspiration for a lot of women, and so you touched on a little bit of your personal story, but how has it influenced your approach to public education and advocacy?
I think for me, my story, when I use my story and when I tell my story, I think it drives home for people that yes, I have 20 years experience of working in this field and I have degrees and all of these things, but also I know what it's like to be on the receiving end of that kind of violence. And I also know what it's like to be on the receiving end of systemic apathy, of the police not caring, of my employer not caring. And so I know by sharing that, I'm building trust with other survivors in the room, with other people who've experienced violence in their life. But honestly, I think for me, the biggest link between my personal experience and my professional life is just the motivation to stay in it. This work is really hard. I receive a tremendous amount of backlash. I took on the Canadian Armed Forces in 2015, and as a result, it created this national conversation about sexual violence in the military, which is great. But it was at a great cost to me personally. I told my story exclusively to the CBC, and they recommended that I leave the country before the story broke because they couldn't guarantee my safety. I can't speak at public events without a security detail. Like, these are real consequences that I face for trying to address gender-based violence in Canada. And so I think if I didn't have that personal experience, I wouldn't have such a fire in me to say, no, this is scary and it's awful. But I have to think about, what did 20-year-old me need? Who did she need? She needed someone like me now who could fight for her. And so that it's not the reason I got into the work, but it's absolutely the reason why I've been in it for as long as I have.
And in your opinion, what are sort of the next steps or advancements needed in the field of bystander intervention and women's rights advocacy?
I think it's exactly what you said from the top, right? We just need more of it. Every time, like I know I'm a great facilitator, but I know it's the content itself gets people so excited. The free public trainings that I offer, 99% of people, thousands of people have taken that training, and 99% of them say that they have at least one tool in their toolbox they did not have. And 98.5% of people said they would recommend the training to a friend. People are hungry for this training. They are hungry for this knowledge, for these tools, because it's the absolute antidote to apathy, right? But so we just need it to be more widespread. We need more schools to be welcoming of myself and my colleagues to come in there and have this conversation with youth. We need workplaces, whether it's unions or management, to create that professional development, create those opportunities, because we know the work is good. We know there's an appetite for it. but it's just getting in the door that is just so difficult. And that's, I think, if we can address that, then I think we're going to make a major amount of headway.
All right. So I want people listening that, I mean, I am fascinated with this. So sign me up. I'm totally going
Awesome.
to be doing one of these with you, Julie. This is incredible. But I know people listening have got to be interested as well. So where can they find you, find out more about the bystander intervention, find your book, even just follow along. You share great stuff all the time.
Thank you. Yeah, so if you just search for Julie S. Lalonde, even on Google, but you'll find me on Instagram, on Twitter, on Blue Sky. I have 3 more free public trainings available for this year, and they all mark really important dates. So November 25th, which is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, I have a free webinar for anyone to join. And then on December 6th, which many of your listeners will know, right, is the anniversary of the Montreal Massacre. And so it's Canada's National Day of Action and Remembrance. And so I'm offering 2 trainings that day, one in English and one in French. And they're free and they're open to anyone over the age of 12 to attend. And your cameras and microphones are muted. So they're very, you're never on the spot. You know, you could be multitasking. You could be watching with your children, with your spouse, with your whole team if it's a workplace. But I think it's a great opportunity to mark these important dates, and to not just, sit in remembrance of women who've lost their lives to violence, but really equip yourself to be able to prevent it from happening to someone else.
All right, incredible. I'm going to put these links up on whatshesaidtalk.com as well, so that people can find them all, and, connect with you. So thank you, Julie, for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.